My name is Average Joe, and I'm a proud geek with expertise in movies, superheroes, and animation.
My name is Beef Pork Ribs. I'm a fine repository of esoteric knowledge, which I suppose most people would qualify as geeky. Though I dabble in many fandoms, my main areas of expertise are anime, movies, and Belgian comics, with a strong recent insurgency of D&D.
Our mission is to bring nerd and geek culture to the masses
by sticking it all under the microscope.
Welcome to the Bat Jar Podcast.
Movies, comics, graphic novels, TV, cartoons, animation, nerds or geeks, entertainment culture. Hear it on the Bat Jar, Nerdy Power. Nerds and geeks, come gather around the scene. Come and join us in the Bat Jar. Come and tune into Average Joe and his team. Lots of room here in the Bat Jar. When the newest nerdy news drops, these podcast pals put it under the scope. DC, Marvel, Disney, Star Wars, cinematic, multiverses, mega Christmas, strangest franchise. Hear it on the Bat Jar, Nerdy Power.
Hello there, and welcome to the Rat Rast, where we put Roger under the microscope.
Like, zoinks, that was a pretty bad impersonation of Scooby, but then again, so was this movie.
Oh boy, how are you? I'm briefly
Okay, I am not an expert on voicing Scooby-Doo, so I will happily spend the rest of the podcast just talking in my regular Average Joe voice. Apologies to everyone for having to listen to that. Maybe the Scooby voice will come back later. Who knows? Beef Pork Ribs, I've got someone sad to tell you. Are you ready?
I was born ready.
You were born ready for a lot of things, which is kind of concerning, but that's fine. I was building a puzzle this week, a 1,000-piece puzzle, and I finally finished it last night, except there's one piece missing. And I don't know where it is. I can only assume that when I put this puzzle away the last time I did it, I missed a piece. So now I have a 999-piece puzzle with one piece missing, like pretty much in the middle. And now the completionist in me is so upset that I can't say I finished the puzzle.
I have a solution. All you're missing is One Piece, so just watch all of One Piece.
I guess, yeah. That's like the ultimate. How am I supposed to do that? I'm a completionist. How am I supposed to watch all of One Piece? There's like 1,000 episodes.
But none of them are missing.
This week we have with us once again Ben the movie buff. Maybe he'll show more compassion to my puzzle plight.
Hey, how are you? I'm Ben, and I'm a movie buff, and yes, I will be compassionate towards your puzzle plight there, Average Joe. Yeah, I'm kind of a completionist as well in certain things, and sometimes when I've done like 99% of the work, and there's one thing I'm missing, it's hard to fall asleep at night knowing that you are so close, but yet so far away.
I was listening to a podcast in the past couple weeks now about fan podcasting, which is basically what this is, because we're all fans, none of us are professionals. And they recommended having recurring segments in your show, which we kind of do, but we don't have names for them. So we're going to try to start kind of putting labels on the different things we do in this podcast, which will probably sound weird for a while. The names will probably change, but I think eventually we'll get to a spot where we actually like all the names we've given to our segments. So every time a former guest comes back to the show, we ask them what they've been up to since they were last on the show. So we're going to go into this segment now called What You Been Doing. And for this particular segment today, we have a guest who has been on the show in some time now. Michael Andrew is here with us today. So Michael Andrew, please tell us what you've been doing since you were last on the show. Nerdy or geeky?
Oh boy, I wasn't prepared for this. I'm still thinking about that puzzle piece that you're missing. What I've been doing, I've been drinking a lot of coffee. I feel like that's what everybody's been doing. I've really just been trying to drink everything that is under the sun, ice cold, just experimenting. I've mixed coffee with orange juice in the past month or so. So I don't know how people feel about that, but I find that very enjoyable.
You'd be proud of me, Michael Andrew. I actually finished a whole can of coffee.
Canned coffee?
Like a can. Like you go to the grocery store, you buy a big giant kind of can of ground up coffee to use in a coffee maker. I bought one like the second week of quarantine, and I've actually like finished the whole thing now. I had to buy a second one.
I thought initially it was some sort of like pre-made coffee in a can, and I was very interested in trying it out. But I'm a little bit disappointed that's not the case. But I'm also very proud of you.
I'm no coffee expert, but I think they're usually called tins. However, those coffee cans totally a thing in Japan.
Got to get to Japan then. Got to try those out.
Well, Michael Andrew, it's good to have you here. Somebody else who shares the concern of the puzzle. And that has been our segment for this week, What You Been Doing. And this will actually transition now into our next segment. Every time we talk about a franchise for the first time on the podcast, we generally learn about how each person who's on the episode was introduced to that franchise. So we're going to enter the segment called Secret Origin segment, or SOS for short. So Beef Pork Ribs, to get us started with our SOS here, how were you first introduced to the Scooby-Doo franchise?
When I was young, there was a video rental store. I know, thing of the past now, but it was a video rental store and ice cream shop. It was called Flicks and Flavors, because you could rent movies and have ice cream. It was great, and as a family, we went there quite often. And um, at some point, we started like there were all the different categories, and one of the categories, like one of the shelf, had like all the Scooby Doo things. And one day we decided to go through it, and we went through a lot of them. I believe we were first exposed to no, it was the original series. Never mind, I was wrong. I believe the first one I watched was the episode with the Creeper from the original series, and kind of collectively as a family, we fell in love with it.
Where are you? We got some work to do now. Scooby-Dooby-Doo, where are you? We need some help from you now.
And as such, we just kept watching them. And then What's New Scooby Doo was a thing. Watched all of those. And I don't know, it's just I watched a ton of them when I was a kid. Really enjoyed them. I had a particular fond memory of the original Hanna-Barbera cartoons, just because of the weird tradition they had of playing a weird like 60s love song on top of the chase scenes. Um, and then yeah, I remember like we watched a lot of the animated movies. We were ambivalent about whether we liked the fact that they were now going against real monsters sometimes and sometimes not. But on the whole, always enjoyed it quite a bit. I remember the live action movie, like the original live action with Sarah Michelle Gellar. I remember it fondly, but probably because I was still young and influenceable. I haven't seen it as much recently, uh, but I do remember liking it better than the newer live action one that I've watched. I was like, this is kind of the suck, and I find it unfortunate that it's a series that has been very good in the past, but was looking forward to the possible revival in the movie, but I was very skeptical going into it, and I guess we'll get into that more. But yeah, it's just been a series I've been in love with since childhood and has a dear place in my heart.
So I think it was possible that I watched a bit of Scooby-Doo as a kid, obviously growing up in Canada. But I think where I got really into Scooby-Doo was my mom. She's from the States. So 1 to 2 times every year, we'd go visit my grandmother. And whenever we'd go there, of course, they would have the Cartoon Network in the States, where they had all sorts of old and new cartoons playing. And Scooby-Doo played, I believe the old Scooby-Doo did play on that channel for quite some time. And I know once in a while they would have marathons where they just play Scooby-Doo all day. So I think being in the States, watching Cartoon Network was where I got exposed to a lot of Scooby-Doo. So much so that I still have this memory of me going to Canada's Wonderland, probably in the early 2000s. And I'd worked up, I think, about like $30 or something like that. And there was a cart with Scooby-Doo toys and fluffies and or like stuffed dolls and other little knickknacks that were all about Scooby-Doo. And I remember spending like 20 minutes there trying to figure out how many different Scooby-Doo items I could get for $30 or less. And I can't remember exactly what I got, but I do remember getting a few things and just being in love with them for the next few weeks because I was in Scooby-Doo mania. So yeah, Scooby-Doo is one of those nostalgic things for me.
My story is very similar to Ben. I grew up where Cartoon Network was a big source of entertainment for me, and I know that in the early 2000s, maybe late 1990s, they were replaying the original series, which is, if I'm not mistaken, Scooby Doo, Where Are You? And they would just play that throughout the night. So that is my experience with them, is just watching show after show, episode after episode of Scooby Doo, Where Are You?
Quick, Scoob, give me the key. You threw it out the window. We gotta get that key and get out of here.
I wouldn't say I was a big fan, nor am I a big fan. It's just I just watched so many of it that it's just so stuck in my head, and it has a lot of entertainment value to it. So that's my experience with it. And I remember the first live action movie, and I'm not gonna get into it. I know that it's a very controversial, and people have controversial ideas and opinions on that. But yeah, so that's my exposure to Scooby Doo.
For whatever reason, I can distinctly remember that my first time being exposed to Scooby-Doo was the 1999 direct-to-video movie Scooby-Doo and the Witch's Ghost.
It's the all-new, fully animated movie, Scooby-Doo and the Witch's Ghost.
Ghost hunting's our specialty.
So hop aboard the Mystery Machine for a Scoob-tacular ride and bring home the mystery with Scooby-Doo and the Witch's Ghost today.
And we were a family that always seemed to get movies on VHS when they came out. So that is inferred in my memory as the first time I ever watched a Scooby-Doo anything. And what's unique about that movie is that it was part of a string of Scooby-Doo movies where, as Beef Pork Ribs kind of mentioned, they were actually dealing with supernatural threats and not just people in costumes. So because it was my first time being exposed to Scooby-Doo, I had no idea that that was really outside the norm for them. And so I just sort of absorbed as like, okay, this is what Scooby-Doo is. It's a supernatural detective story with kind of some zany elements here. And I just sort of went with it. And I really remember watching a lot of those direct-to-video movies. And I would have been just the right age when the 2002 live-action movie came out and its sequel and What's New Scooby-Doo was on. I didn't really watch it. I was watching other things. But I've always been interested in Scooby-Doo as a franchise. I think it's very fun and the characters are interesting, and I love a good detective story. So the fact that Scooby-Doo kind of tries to bill itself as a detective-based or like a crime-solving series, that's always kind of captured my attention. And while we're still here within this Secret Origin segment, maybe if everyone wants to just mention their favorite iteration of Scooby-Doo. So this could be a movie, could be a show, could be maybe even a particular episode if you really have that strong a memory for it. But let's hear everyone's favorite iteration of Scooby-Doo, and we'll go in the same order we did for our Secret Origin.
So overall, the original Scooby-Doo, Where Are You? It blows everything else out of the water. But there is the one direct-to-video movie that I will always remember fondly, even though I don't remember the title of it. It's the one with the aliens where Shaggy ends up falling in love with this girl and her, like Shaggy and Scooby fall in love with this girl and her dog that are like totally in 60s clothing, and it's, they make a huge big deal about it, and there's like a song, like a love song about the two of them that I still kind of remember. And the reason why it was another girl stuck in the 60s like him, even though, this was probably early 2000 by the time this movie came out, I actually very much loved it, and I won't spoil anything.
For me, I think like it's got to be the original show that I think stands out to me the most. But if I had to give second place or silver award, it would be to, and I just had to look it up a minute ago, called, I guess it was a direct to video release called Scooby Doo and the Reluctant Werewolf. And this is one where all I can remember about it is that the gang, I guess, go to like Dracula's castle for some reason, and they find that all of the classic movie monsters do this race, I guess, every year where Dracula's kind of the one in charge of organizing everything, and they basically have to go on this wacky race where they go through all sorts of different dangers and threats. And I guess I think Scooby and Shaggy are kind of participating in the race, and they have to try and get first place. So I do remember that one being quite enjoyable as a kid.
For myself, um, the original Scooby Doo series, which is Scooby Doo, Where Are You? But if I were to pick a specific, perhaps episode or a movie, I would actually say it's the crossover episode with Scooby Doo and I believe Johnny Bravo. Um, I don't even know if it's a good episode, but I just enjoyed the idea of having two characters from different episodes um, being in one show. So I really enjoyed that, and I believe Scooby Doo had a bunch of those types of crossover episodes. But that's the one that I remembered being able to watch both shows and for that to come together.
I'm on my way to visit my Aunt Jibadiza, and I'd sure hate to be late. She lives in this spooky house up on Widow's Peak.
Spooky house? Jinkies!
Jinkies?
Hey, gang, what do you say we give this guy a lift?
Yeah, there was definitely a period in the 1970s, 1980s where basically Scooby-Doo was crossing over with everybody from Josie and the Pussycats to Batman and Robin to the Harlem Globetrotters. You know, it's like they were literally meeting anyone and everyone. So I definitely would believe that Johnny Bravo was there.
And fairly more recently, I think the last thing before I watched this movie that I had seen of Scooby Doo was with my cousins. Was the movie with John Cena, which was pretty hilarious as well. So they're still doing those weird crossovers.
Yeah, there's actually an episode of Supernatural where the main characters from Supernatural get sucked into an episode of Scooby-Doo and they're animated. I've watched parts of that. I don't watch Supernatural, but I was interested in the idea, so I've seen clips from it, and it seems hilarious. For myself, of course, I have an opinion on this. I think the best iteration of Scooby-Doo is a series from the 2010s called Scooby-Doo Mystery Incorporated. It actually was a really well-written show that actually had a kind of like a serialized storyline, and the detective element and the mystery was actually interesting. And I didn't watch the whole thing, but every time I did see an episode, it was really cool to see how well characterized each of the main characters were beyond kind of like the stereotypes associated with them. And for example, in this show, Fred has this big thing about traps. Like he actually like just really loves like setting traps for like catching villains, and that was kind of like part of his shtick. And I thought that was a really fun thing to do for his character. My favorite Scooby-Doo movie has to be Scooby-Doo and Batman: The Brave and the Bold, because they literally did a crossover movie between Scooby-Doo and the Batman series, The Brave and the Bold. And it's just everything that's excellent about Batman, The Brave and the Bold, and most versions of Scooby-Doo. So if you guys haven't heard of that, you should go check it out for sure. Talking generally about Scooby-Doo as a franchise going into this new film, to this point there have been 33 direct-to-DVD animated films. There have been 5 live-action movies made, 2 that got a theatrical release, and 3 that were direct-to-television films. And there have been over 400 episodes of televised animation. All that to say, since the first show started in 1969, Scooby-Doo has been very, very prevalent. It's probably been one of the most successful series to come out of Hanna-Barbera. Although maybe not as famous as like the Flintstones or the Jetsons, it certainly has had more staying power. Like it has had a lot of different iterations, a lot of different versions. There have been kind of eras of the series. Frank Welker, who was the original voice of Fred in the very first show, has actually maintained his role all the way up until present day. And I actually got to see Frank Welker in person last August when I went to Fan Expo. And he kind of joked about it. He said, like, yeah, like I'm kind of known for doing all these crazy voices, but he said Fred was just what my voice sounded like back then. And he said, thankfully, I sound like a little kid. So even now, when he's like 50 years older, he can still kind of get his voice into that range to sound like he did as essentially as a teenager. So, needless to say, Scooby Doo is a very prevalent franchise. So I was quite, I guess, concerned when this film was announced because, first of all, they were choosing to do it as a a theatrical release, which was like, okay, if you are trying to do a theatrical release, you want to appeal to a larger audience than whoever would be buying your direct-to-video movies. That's fine. But then they announced that the cast was going to be celebrities playing the parts. And we've had this conversation before with other films that at the end of the day, a lot of celebrities are not good voice actors. Like they get cast in movies because of what they look like, because of their stage presence, because of how they emote with their face and their physical presence. And unfortunately, it just does not translate over to voice acting a lot of the times. And it's one thing when it's like something like, I'm going to say Cinderella, which was a thing like 50 years ago, and none of those actors are still living. But in the case of Scooby Doo, they're continually producing new content. So all the actors who actually play these parts and know them well are still working, but you choose to bring in celebrities for the sake of the name recognition. So, as from the very first announcement of this movie, and I saw that they were casting celebrities in the parts, I was already skeptical at best.
I was not aware of that fact, but it explains so much about the terrible voice acting in this movie.
So, Ben the Movie Buff, Michael Andrew, did you guys have a reaction when this film was announced, or was it only when it was being released like 2 weeks ago did you know about it?
Well, I think I saw the first trailer when, movie theaters were still up and running. And yeah, from what I saw of the one or two trailers of the movie, I think when I see a trailer for a movie like this, when something like Scooby Doo has had such staying power, like you said, Average Joe, and we've seen different iterations of the show, and we've seen 2 live action movies and other direct to DVD and video movies. Um, I think seeing a trailer like this didn't do much to win me over. I just looked at it and thought, you know what? I'm sure the movie will be hopefully fine, but unless they do something really incredible, unless they do something really special, I feel like it'll probably just be like a lot of other attempts to bring certain properties like this back, right? Where it's like we're going to kind of do the same thing that we've done before, and hopefully you enjoy it. So, as I said last week, like I was mildly interested, but I wasn't in any rush to check it out.
And for myself, I actually did not see the trailer. I think I saw an ad for it one time. That's the only reason I was aware of it. I wasn't even aware that they were casting big celebrity names, but I knew that I was only interested in the movie for the nostalgic reason, but nothing really more. I didn't really have high expectations for it, and it basically played out as I expected it to be.
So after the success of Trolls World Tour, Warner Brothers made the decision to make this a digital release so that people on the day that they could have gone to go see in theaters, had it not been for COVID-19, that people could actually rent it to watch at home at like a premium price. So I know in the States, some places were selling it for like $20 for a rental. Here in Canada, most places I saw, they were charging $25. And at this point, I don't have any solid numbers as to how much the movie is actually generated from doing those sales. Every article I found was talking about its performance without actually giving away any numbers. But I'm looking at an article now from Forbes, and they kind of mentioned that Scoob hit the top of the charts for both Google Play Amazon and iTunes faster than Trolls did, which would lead you to assume that if it hit number 1 faster, that it would have made as much money, if not a little more, especially since I believe the price to rent Trolls was $20, whereas this one was set at $25. So for all we know, it's actually made a lot of money already, and they just don't have any financial numbers out there yet. But this is, again, kind of setting a precedent to ask the question, is that are people willing, in the absence of going to an actual movie theater, to pay $20 to $25 to rent a movie in their own home? And Ben, the movie buff, I know you're a huge fan of going to the theater, as am I. Beef Pork Ribs is kind of more of the guy who would rather watch movies at home. So the fact that we can get new movies directly to rent at home is probably a benefit to him. But Michael, Andrew, where do you sit on this whole rather go to the theater or rather watch at home debate?
For a premium movie, I would definitely love to watch it in theaters. Although I don't know if I necessarily categorize the Scooby-Doo movie as premium, so I definitely was not planning on watching it in theaters. I probably was more likely waiting for it until it comes out into one of the streaming platforms that's available.
Yeah, I think obviously the thing that Trolls and Scoob have in common is that they're family films, so it might work that this could be a new way of actually releasing movies in the future, is by putting them out for digital rental and people actually make money that way.
Yeah, I was watching a video recently where they were mentioning if you're a family with 2 or more kids wanting to go see something like Trolls World Tour or Scoob, that it's going to cost way more money if you have to bring your whole family to the theater. I mean, unless you go to a matinee or a cheap night. But something like this, where you only have to pay $20 or $25 and then you have the movie right in your home, is obviously something that I think is definitely resonating with a lot of families right now.
I think we kind of talk about like the history of all the Scooby-Doo movies mostly being like not theater release, and I think that it probably would have done worse if it had gone to theater because of early reviews and things like that, more possibly. But having it available to download is a closer approximation to a direct to TV kind of experience. So I think that might have played a role also in it doing really well. And yeah, like Ben said, it is a family movie. Um, but it also had a bit of nostalgia riding on it, which makes some of the decisions that they took kind of interesting. But I do think that like as far as like the way it was released was probably better for it, possibly even than if it had gone out in theaters.
Those are all really good points. I hadn't thought about most of those. The one thing that was, when this movie was announced, I was like, it's good that they're doing it animated, because as much as I enjoy the live action movies with those actors in it, Scooby Doo as a character, it he basically looks like a cartoon anyway in those movies, like with the CGI, and to try and make him look like a realistic greyhound, it would have been silly. And so I just think personally Scooby Doo is a franchise that just works best in animation. So the fact that they did choose to make this an animated film was a step in the right direction. Making it a 3D animated film, we'll talk more about that later. But getting into what the critics and what the audiences are saying, currently at Rotten Tomatoes, this movie has a 52% from critics, which, as we get into discussing the film, will make a lot of sense. And the review from audiences is 65%, which, as we get into it, will probably also make a lot of sense. And of course, since cinemas are not open, we can't get any information about what Cinema Score is saying, but that's okay because we can just talk about ourselves. So, and for the record, the title of this film is called Scoob! Exclamation mark, which I think is a dumb title. I don't know why they called it that. But having said that, let's get into the actual movie itself. Beef Pork Ribs. Why don't you tell us the story of the movie as it's going to be written on the potential Blu-ray case for Scoob?
I'm gonna start by giving my theory as to why it was called Scoob and not Scooby Doo. It's because, like Dragon Ball Evolution, which was a Dragon Ball Z movie, they wanted to evoke the franchise without attaching themselves to it in case they needed to bail. Okay, so the Blu-ray of this
You know his name.
Scooby!
Scooby.
Doo!
It's nice to be wanted.
You know his game.
You are officially out of everything.
But there's one thing you don't know.
Oh, I totally have the answer.
You can see his new movie.
Where?
Like where?
Right at home.
Like if you want, you can pull over and drop us off here.
We'll walk home.
Scoob. Rated PG. Exclusive early access with home premiere. Available to own May 15.
You loved him in the 60s. You loved him in the 2000s. But now, it's kind of gone. Remember Scooby-Doo and all the great things you loved about it? It's not in this movie. Okay, I'm being a little harsh. To give an actual definition of what's happening in the story, it's a story about friendship and potentially fighting monsters and or supervillains. It's hard to tell.
Oh man, that is probably the most ruthless plot description we've gotten on the podcast yet, but I love it nonetheless.
I am very upset about this movie.
So talking about the animation style, so the fact that they chose to do it in 3D animation, I prefer 2D animation personally, so that was kind of annoying to see it pivot to 3D animation. But having said that, I did generally like the way the characters were designed because they did look Scooby-Doo-like or Scooby-Doo-esque. With some of the humans, they kind of had like the Disney effect going on where they made their eyes bigger. But other than that, I thought the characters looked fine.
I will say I did not like the character design of Velma, but for the rest, it was pretty decent, yes.
So I kind of ripped on the choice to hire celebrity actors earlier. I don't understand. Okay, so this is me ranting again, but Matthew Lillard, who played Shaggy in the live-action films from the early 2000s, he actually became the official voice of Shaggy in all the animated stuff when Casey Kasem died. They actually, in the Mystery Incorporated show I mentioned earlier, Casey Kasem played Shaggy's father, and Matthew Lillard played Shaggy. So there was this beautiful passing of the torch, like this father-son thing that went on there. And so for the last 10 plus years, Matthew Lillard has actually been the official voice of Shaggy. So why on earth would they choose to hire somebody else to play Shaggy in this movie? And Will Forte, who sure, he's a funny guy, but I could never, from the first trailer, I had it felt like he was someone trying to do a Shaggy impression and not actually.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Average Joe. For all the problems of the live-action Scooby-Doo movies, I think I can picture Matthew Lillard's voice as Shaggy, and I definitely would have liked him to do the voice in this movie. And I did want to bring up a quick fact that I actually thought was kind of cool, because I think, as we know, lots of different actors have done voice acting work, but oddly enough, Mark Wahlberg, this is his first animated movie where he's done voice work. He has never done an animated movie until this one, and I think that's kind of cool given the fact that he's done so many big movies and he's been acting for a while, and I guess he just hasn't done any animated movies until this one.
The initial thing that came to mind is that this might be a reflection on their expectation of how this movie is gonna do or fare, I guess, is that they needed the star power to really bring attention to the movie. Because if it's not a live action movie, it doesn't really make a ton of sense to cast other celebrities or other voice actors when you have the original voice actor or the current voice actor for the animated series available. So
you literally had Frank Welker, who's the voice of Fred. He was in this movie as Scooby-Doo because he's the voice of Scooby-Doo now, in addition to being Fred. So you literally could have, it's not like you didn't have access to the guy. Zac Efron was Fred in this movie, and I could kind of tell it was Zac Efron's voice, but he didn't really feel like he was acting. It just sort of felt like he was just reading the lines as if he was just well, I'm Zac Efron, and I sound cool, so I'm just going to talk, and that's going to be my performance. Or Amanda Seyfried. There could have been any woman in the universe playing that part, because and Gina Rodriguez, who is Velma in this movie, I recognize her voice mostly because I watched the Carmen Sandiego show she's in on Netflix, which is really good. And so I don't know if I liked her performance because it just reminded me of Carmen Sandiego, or if because I actually liked her kind of Latina take on Velma, which is interesting because she's been kind of like portrayed as an Asian in some versions, as Caucasian in some versions, and then this one kind of went for almost like a Latina vibe.
I think though, and I know I might be skipping to another category, and that I'm trying really hard not to rip too hard on the movie, but that like given the script and what happened in the movie, it was a little more justifiable to do this because um actually even not just beyond the script itself, which I don't think was particularly good. I feel like the way the characters was treated, and I'm thinking specifically of like Fred being Zac Efron. Like the portrayal of Fred in this movie works with Zac Efron, but the portrayal of Fred in this movie is the worst portrayal of Fred that's ever been put forth in any iteration of the show. So I think it's kind of, but it would make sense for that Fred to be Zac Efron. So I think it's kind of like an, I don't want to say it's fitting, but it kind of is fitting that the treatment the characters got in this show in this movie kind of matched the idea that you're just going to throw celebrities at them.
Now, that's actually a really good point because it's true. Part of the failings of these performances is the way that they were written. So the fact that Fred is all of a sudden now the tank of the group and not the leader, which has he's usually been portrayed as like the leader who's able to kind of lead the charge. The fact that I mean I actually did appreciate the way they characterized Daphne because in the original show she was just basically a damsel in distress, and they've kind of tried to do different things over years to like help her stand out and be different. Like they had her know all the martial arts in the live action movies. I thought the way they called her like the empath of the team, or like the like kind of like the people person, like as if she was the public relations individual for Mystery Inc. That was probably the one character element that I thought was actually a nice change of pace. But yeah, like the fact that these characters were being voiced by these celebrities, it just sounded like celebrities doing impressions of the characters or just being themselves. Like Ken Jeong is in this movie as Dino Mutt, and half the time I'm like, is that Bill Hader, or is that David Cross? And then I was like, no, I'm pretty sure it's supposed to be Ken Jeong, and he just sounds. Maybe that's a good thing that he actually. I'm used to. I guess I'm too used to like him on Community, where he's like playing this exaggerated character, and he's not talking in like his normal voice. But even Scooby's voice in this movie, like Frank Welker has been the voice of Scooby Doo for over a decade now, and Scooby Doo like he has this weird thing where he talks with all these R's in his voice because he's a dog, and he was much more audible. Like you could actually hear most of what he was saying, and I was like, this Scooby Doo is like too literate all of a sudden. Like we shouldn't be able to understand him so well.
I will say, I have like my notes for the movie, and the first thing I wrote, and I wrote it in the first 5 minutes of the movie, but then I added an exclamation mark and a star beside it. Scooby talks too much, and like it's great to have the voice, and the voice of Scooby sounded more like Scooby Doo than the other characters for obvious reasons, but he talked so much in this movie, like full on conversations. Like Scooby Doo never almost never speaks in full sentences even when he does speak. And then suddenly he's like having conversations and dialogues, and it was a little bit like it was jarring at first. By the end I was getting used to it, but I was still really kind of concerned and annoyed by it.
You bring up a good point, Porphribs, because I think in certain stories, in certain movies, sometimes there are certain things. For example, you have like a dog talking, and every time the dog talks, like Scooby, like he has to sound like this. And I feel like if you're going to use something like that, that I feel like you have to figure out what's the best amount. Like, how often should we be doing this? Because sometimes there are kind of funny recurring gags or funny voices that a character can put on. But sometimes if you do it too much, I find it becomes a little annoying or it loses its effect. And yeah, I wasn't thinking about that while watching the movie, but thinking about it now, yeah, I feel like maybe they did that a bit too much and they should have reeled that back in a bit.
And I think it also, we're probably going to talk about this a little bit later, but it does also play into characterization, but not the characterization so much, but like his relationship with Shaggy, because it's hard to have a disagreement with somebody when you're talking in like 2 or 3 word sentences, but then because the movie needed them to have a major disagreement, it did imply a lot more dialogue between the two of them, which seemed out of place.
So as I mentioned earlier, like the Scooby-Doo franchise is a mystery series. It's a detective series, and people kind of critique most versions of Scooby-Doo because the mysteries are pretty easy to figure out, and it's not really well written detective work. But I heard an interview with the writers of Batman Beyond, and in that interview, they kind of mentioned how challenging it is to write a good detective story that only goes on for 22 minutes because you have to somehow introduce the mystery and introduce at least two different suspects so that someone can be a red herring, but then make it so that when you actually do reveal who is responsible at the end, that it's not just totally obvious who it is. So, I mean, if the Batman writers are giving people a break for writing detective stories in 22 minutes, that's one thing. But this isn't really a detective story. It's not really a mystery story. It's kind of more of an action adventure. Basically, it's like a kind of like a superhero movie. You know, it's this is not really a spoiler to say you know who the villain is very early on in the movie. Like there's no real mystery around who is responsible for what's going on.
Yeah, that's a fair point, Average Joe. I think you can tell that the movie once in a while tries to kind of bring up the mystery aspect and say, "Oh, here's something that they have to try and figure out," or "Here's a little riddle," or whatnot. But you're right that the emphasis seems to be less on that and more about the Blue Falcon and this big adventure that they're going on.
I do have to uh, point out that this reminds me of like targeting, having a target audience. Like, who are they targeting here? I feel like they were trying to please everybody, that they missed everybody by doing that. They weren't sure about the direction of, is this a mystery, or are we just supposed to be entertainment with action? So I think that's what made the series great and not so great in some iterations of it. It's having a clear target audience and sticking with it. And I feel like for this movie, they were trying to please like younger audience because it's a family movie. At the same time, they're trying to please the parents that are paying for this. So they also wanted to add entertainment value for them, which kind of just missed the mark in general.
I will say, like I said it earlier, and I may say it again, I would compare this movie to Dragon Ball Evolution. There was too much of the original material and random nostalgia hooks that if you know nothing about Scooby Doo, you just, like, those things would seem jarring. Um, but there wasn't enough of what was actually good about Scooby Doo so that the fans would actually enjoy it. Like, I can think of a few things, like, they had some of the original Hanna-Barbera sound effects sometimes in the movie, but it just felt weird because everything else was supposed to be uh, very postmodern. It had, it had it had a 3D animation recreation of the original Scooby Dooby Doo opening sequence with the song, and that was cool. But then nothing else about what made that series Scooby Doo. Like I remember, like I had a list of things that things I'm expecting in a Scooby Doo movie, and it hit almost none of those things. But then it still like sometimes gave the original like running animation, and sometimes it would make like commentaries about like, oh well, we're not doing it this way because it's weird. But again, Average Joe and I were talking about this before the podcast. Whereas the live action movie kind of systematically made fun of, like, poked holes at everything that doesn't really work in the original Scooby Doo, this movie just kind of like randomly popped it in sometimes, like, randomly made the comment that Shaggy sounds like what a voice act an old I think they say a middle aged man might think a teenager sounded like in the 60s, and it's like, okay, you can add that into the movie, but if the rest of the movie isn't really focusing on trying to correct or shine a light on those problems, then it's just a throwaway gag for the fans, but you're also putting a gag that's making fun of the show, and you're not really adding anything new to it. It just felt really out of place.
That was, as dull and kind of predictable and just not good the story of this movie is. I actually found a lot of the dialogue very clever. So like that comment about Scooby Doo sounding like a middle aged man's impression of a teenager. I actually thought that was really funny, and I thought a lot of like the kind of offhanded comments people were making and the references they were making, I thought they were actually quite clever, and I found myself laughing quite a bit during this movie. That might be again maybe my Scooby Doo affinity, my nostalgia was kind of like taking over at that point, and just I was enjoying those references a whole lot. Yeah, I found the dialogue funny, even though the story itself was.
Yeah, I agree with that. I would say, yeah, the story is nothing terribly special. It's pretty run of the mill. But I do think that with the humor, for a few minutes you might have a variety of jokes here and there that weren't that great. But I find, for every 3 or 4 jokes that didn't work, there was always one joke that was actually really funny, right? Like I like the line that I first heard in the trailer, where I guess Velma is examining a hair of the bad guy, and she says gross amounts of hair oil, 12-year-old scotch, and then Daphne says, "Is the bad guy my dad?" And I also like, I think it's, yeah, later on in the movie, there's a moment, without spoiling it, there's a moment where the Blue Falcon suspects that something is wrong, and he's pretty sure he's right about it. And when it's revealed that he was right, he's like, "Oh, I hate it when I'm right." And then the Dino Dog says, which thank goodness isn't that often or whatnot. So once in a while, there are some funny lines that kind of made me forgive the previous 4 or 5 jokes that weren't that funny.
I do feel like the movie has a pretty good recipe, which I feel like a lot of movies have been doing, especially using these types of references, which is there's a good amount of nostalgia. There's a good amount of breaking the fourth wall as well. And there's a good amount of pop culture references, which kind of just brings it all together and makes it enjoyable for those brief moments, which could tide over pretty bad or bad writing or bad storyline. It keeps you entertained throughout the movie.
Well, I do agree with that. I also find that part of what my problem was that that's not really something that Scooby Doo usually does. And yeah, you can argue Scooby Doo normally is very formulaic, but that's the thing. If you have something that's formulaic, it's usually because A, on many levels it works, and B, because it is something that people kind of wanted. And I just like, yeah, I won't argue there are good moments in the movie. It's not a complete bust, and most of the things you guys talked about, I did find were good, except for the joke about Shaggy's speech mannerisms, which also was weird because his speech mannerisms were completely different in this movie than they've been in everything else. But I still found that that's the thing. Like the pop culture references, not so much, but they also weren't being done the way that they usually are done. Like Scooby Doo has usually a lot of musical pop culture references, and even though they tend to vary in the movies a little bit, but in the original and in What's New Scooby Doo, they had a lot of like kind of more old timey rock songs. I'm not saying all music in Scooby Doo movies should be rock, but that did definitely bug me, the amount of techno and more electronic music there was as opposed to rock music in the movie. But that's probably just my kind of personal bias that way. But I still think that like there was a way to put those things in the movie uh, without it being jarring and without it seeming like they were out of place.
Random plug in Scooby Doo on Zombie Island. There's this like random song called "It's Terror Time Again," and it's so like catchy. I love it. I might even throw a bit of it in here for you guys to hear.
You hear the screeching of an owl, you hear the wind begin to howl. You know there's zombies on the prowl, and it's terror time again. They've got you running through the night. It's terror time again, and you just might die of fright. It's a terrifying time.
I know what you're thinking. Those of you listening, you're thinking, you guys, Scooby Doo is meant for kids. Like, you're being too harsh on it. And I say, no, like, just because a franchise has its, target audience as children and people who are growing into adults does not give free license for you to, like, make a bad product. Like, Scooby Doo in particular, there have been very many iterations of it that are well produced, good story, good character. So I don't think I'm being too hard in this movie. I think, if anything, I'm being as hard as I should be on this movie.
This is probably me nitpicking just a little bit, but I do remember one line that clearly wasn't for kids, and that just annoyed me to no end. At some point, the Blue Falcon is having a disagreement with Fred, and then they start to argue, and they start shoving, and Velma just shouts at, "Oh, toxic masculinity!" And I was like, man, that is the worst thing you could put in this movie for so many reasons. Um, I mean, yes, what was happening there was, but that's something that Freddy has only ever had in the live action movie where his entire character was kind of about being self centered. But even there, he wasn't even that much of a macho. And I think you mentioned it earlier, since when is he the tank? He's the leader. He's not supposed to be, he's not supposed to be a jock or a meathead, even though he's drawn as the kind of buff, muscular guy in the original series and onwards. That's never what his character is. Like, the fact that they made him, even the fact that they were making him like a total meathead, like actually stupid in this movie, was kind of out of place. He's not as clever as Velma, obviously, but there are very few iterations where Freddy is actually stupid. And I think, again, I had a lot of problem with the characterization they made, and I think they did this to Daphne and Velma. They made them kind of like one-note characters. And I'm not saying that they are complex characters in the original series or anything, but like you said, there are some things that they do that is very them. Velma is clumsy. And yes, it's a bit of an excuse for her to lose her glasses and confuse people, which is an easy laugh in the episodes, but that is part of her character canonically most of the time. Fred might be a little more overconfident, and Fred loves making traps, even though it wasn't like an explicit thing in some of the older shows. It was still something he enjoyed doing. And but instead they just kind of gave these very baseline characteristics. And yes, Daphne was usually not much more than a damsel in distress, uh, although she was usually pretty good at, you know, not sticking to that role and being able to take care of herself, especially in the later iteration. And now, even though like her being empathetic was a nice character trait, it was still her one character trait, and that's all she had basically. And I think that the person who suffered the most from this was Shaggy, because they kind of kept him as a scary cat slacker in some ways, but then downplayed for conflict the bond that he and Scooby share, even though the entire movie is supposed to be about that. And I thought that that was kind of a really weird thing to do, and it didn't seem to fit neither his character in that movie nor the character of Shaggy generally. So I just, yeah, really disliked a lot of the characterization and a lot of the way that they were just kind of trying to plug things in.
This is a good a time as any to enter the spoiler verse, which is of course where we go to talk about spoilers from movies. So, having heard all we've said so far, you would probably lead us to believe it's not worth watching this movie. Give it a shot if you want. We'll talk more after the spoiler time about our final thoughts. So there will be a time code in the description. We can skip around the spoiler verse so that you don't get spoiled. There's not a lot, so it will be a shorter spoiler verse time this week. But nonetheless, we're going inside the spoiler verse to talk about spoilers for this movie. You were kind of leading this here, Ben, the movie buff, or you were leading us here, before Grizz, by talking about Scooby and Shaggy's relationship. The conflict that they have here, where they need to like prove themselves as worthy members of Mystery Inc. This is exactly the whole thing they went through in like the second live action Scooby Doo movie. Like in that film, they make a mistake and they're kind of like, oh, they're the weak link because they're kind of useless. And so the whole movie at that point in 2004 was about them trying to prove themselves worthy, and it was all about them kind of embracing like their kind of like their personalities and how they contributed to the group. So the fact that they were revisiting that same storyline here, it seems kind of derivative. It implies that there isn't anything new that can be done with these characters, because I guess that's the one thing Shaggy and Scooby need to do. And like the whole idea that Shaggy's like jealous because Scooby Doo gets to like go on the superhero thing. It's like, Shaggy, you had every option to go on the adventure with him. You didn't have to like say, no, man, like I'm out. Like there was.
Yeah, so I wanted to talk about that for a second because I think that's one of the things that kind of bugged me about the movie was that, and I get it. like it is a kids movie, but it is also clearly meant to have a lot of nods and references to older Scooby-Doo shows and movies for the older people in the audience that have grown up with Scooby-Doo. And I think when you write a story about like, oh, we're going to do Scooby-Doo movie, and kind of at the focus here, the heart of the movie is about Scooby and Shaggy's friendship. Theoretically, I think that can work. I just think the way they set up the story and the way that like, oh, Scooby and Shaggy are kind of being are getting into disagreements and whatnot, and Shaggy's getting jealous. I feel like in a way you kind of write yourself into a corner because you know 30 minutes into the movie, I knew exactly where Scooby and Shaggy were going to end up with their friendship. And I mean, I think anyone, literally with a brain will be able to figure it out. It's not at all like surprising when you finally get there. And I also found it, once again, another thing that I was not crazy about was how at the end, when there's that reveal of like, oh, one of you have to go to the door and touch it, and then you have to be on the other side of the gate, right? So of course Scooby and Shaggy are like, oh, it's gonna be me, no, it's gonna be me, and they go back and forth, and then Shaggy decides to be the one to actually go on the other side of the gate, and it's like, oh, now we don't have Shaggy. I was like, guys, come on, like I would be actually very surprised if they followed through with that and Shaggy had to stay there. But of course, we need a happy ending. We need Shaggy to come back to show that everything's okay. So I think that's one of the problems with the story for me is that with everything that's being set up, it's not all that surprising where those two characters end up.
I'll add to that. Yeah, it was pretty weak plot point. It made less sense than in the live action movie because there was a direct screw up which had cost them something. Whereas this, it was just Simon Cowell comes in and tells them they're not good enough because they don't pay attention when he's talking. Also, he was talking about the different roles that they have, and spoiler at the end, they're like, "Oh, but Scooby and Shaggy are the heart." I mean, anybody who knows anything about kind of that structure of characters, the hero, the lancer, the rival, and the heart, like, yeah, it was. I mean, they're not exactly like that, but like, obviously, Scooby and Shaggy are the heart. It's always been that, and it's always been very obvious. And yeah, they do talk about like at some point Daphne talks about how they used to like accidentally hit switches, which is like justifying them. But again, I didn't think that was fair because that happens to all the different characters for different reasons in the show. But I think there was something that really hit me really hard in the kind of the ridiculousness of this plot line, this plot point, and the way that Scooby and Shaggy were interacting was that Shaggy never says Scooby old buddy old pal old friend. Like, that's one of his lines. That's one of the things he says and he never said it, and you kind of just have this idea, well, are they really that close friends? And like they went through the trouble of introducing how they met at the beginning, but then they met the rest of the gang like what, a few days later, maybe the same day, it was hard to tell, but there was nothing that established why there was a stronger link between Shaggy and Scooby because yes, it was his first friend, but then he immediately made three really good friends that he stayed friends just as long. Whereas if anybody who watches Scooby Doo, like there's an implication that Shaggy and Scooby have known each other a lot longer, and canonically it also happens to in a lot of the different iterations. And so it seemed weird to just randomly have them be jealous. And like Average Joe said, there was no reason for Shaggy to be jealous of Scooby. And the thing again, like the thing that caused the conflict towards the end is that Scooby took off the necklace that Shaggy had said that he told Shaggy to never take off, but as Scooby Doo pointed out, Shaggy had just told him to take it off. Like it's ridiculous, and also it's kind of once again bad characterization. It's making Shaggy look like a petty, insecure person, which has never been him. He's always just stuck by his boy through thick and through thin. And yes, they've been afraid together. But again, like Average Joe said, the live action movie was more about them accepting who they are rather than them growing as characters.
I kind of wish because this movie is kind of like setting up like a Hanna-Barbera cinematic universe. It like includes Blue Falcon and Captain Caveman, and there's like I think there's other references to other Hanna-Barbera characters. I would rather if they had like called this, I don't know, something else and then just had the Scooby-Doo characters in it, because what this really feels like is like a Blue Falcon movie guest starring the cast of Scooby-Doo, rather than a Scooby-Doo movie with the cast of other Hanna-Barbera properties.
Yeah, that's a fair point. And even I'm curious to hear what you guys thought about this. Another thing I wasn't exactly crazy about, and I wonder if maybe this kind of led to why some of the characters feel kind of one note, is that, as you said, Average Joe, there is a big emphasis on Scooby and Shaggy eventually joining with the Blue Falcon and going on various adventures with him. And I think because of that, it means that you have to separate Scooby and Shaggy from Velma, Daphne, and Fred, which means that a lot of the exciting stuff, from what I remember, tends to happen with Blue Falcon, whereas Fred, Daphne, and Velma are kind of like cast off to the side in a way. And I mean, once again, I get it. Like, it's because the heart of the movie is this friendship between Scooby and Shaggy, but I found that their dynamic as a team, I feel like we don't get to explore as much in this movie because they're separated for a fair amount of time. And I know someone could make the argument that, well, geez, like in every iteration of Scooby-Doo, they spend time as a gang together. And yeah, like for me, I think the last Scooby-Doo thing I probably watched was the Monsters Unleashed sequel, the live action movie from, I think it was 2004. So it means like I haven't watched a Scooby-Doo movie in over 10 years. So for me, I'm curious to see how this film approaches their dynamic. And from what I can tell, like it's just kind of like, their typical dynamic in other properties. So I would have been curious to see a bit more, to see if they could have done something, or whether the whole gang could have been with Blue Falcon for more of the movie, because the way I found it, I wasn't sure how I felt about that.
I mean, there's always the joke about how in Scooby-Doo they split up to look for clues, but you're right. There is usually more time where they're actually like all together trying to solve the mystery than they did in this movie.
The other thing, I think I mentioned this before, but I was like legitimately upset about this. There isn't a single chase scene in this movie, and once again, yeah, you could say they're trying to do something different, and maybe they're trying to include other things and other stereotypes that weren't there before. But that is an integral part of a Scooby-Doo movie or episode, is having a chase scene with ridiculous music in the background. And like, yes, it's formulaic, but it's also at the core of what I think of when I think of Scooby-Doo. I think of the ridiculous chase scene and, weirdly inappropriate music playing during it because it's funny. And you like, I know that's not what kids nowadays are growing up with, but look, it's something that's been a staple of Scooby-Doo since the late 60s. So obviously it still appeals to kids in different generation. They just refuse to put it in the movie for reasons I cannot fathom. Ben, if you're talking, you're muted right now.
Nope, sorry, not talking, just accidentally hit the hand button.
Now, all that being said, I did actually find Dick Dastardly a very fun villain. He was played by Jason Isaacs, who we would know as Lucius Malfoy from the Harry Potter movies, and I thought that was a good example of an actor like slipping into the role. Like I couldn't tell it was the same guy. It just sounded like this guy was doing this really fun villain part, and yeah, his whole plan's kind of I was confused by it, but I was like, you know what? I'm here for the characters, and as a villain, like he was very engaging in that sense.
I think, yeah, he was definitely one of the best part of the movie, but again, he wasn't a Scooby-Doo villain. He wasn't wearing a mask. He wasn't hiding anything. He was he was the Falcon's villain that happened to be after Scooby-Doo as well. So, like, he was just kind of there. But no, he was definitely a very enjoyable character.
And you know what? There were a couple of really clever Easter eggs in this movie. For example, Shaggy runs into this arcade at one point, and you see a poster for the Hex Girls on the wall. The Hex Girls were a group of characters introduced in Scooby-Doo and the Witch's Ghost, the movie that I first was introduced to Scooby-Doo through. And they've made a couple appearances in other versions of Scooby-Doo, but the fact that they had that level of detail, like that's a deep dive into Scooby-Doo lore. Or the fact that they had Messick Mountain, which was of course named for Don Messick, who was the original voice for Scooby-Doo. Or the fact that to illustrate how big a fan Shaggy was of Blue Falcon, they actually had Blue Falcon and Dynamite Funko Pops on his childhood bedroom dresser. And I was like, that is an incredible amount of detail that as a let's say I'm a collector of Funko Pops, I appreciated that.
I think if we're going into kind of final things, I don't know if we're going towards final thoughts, but the last thing that I feel I need to say about the movie is I did find it cute that they had your Easter eggs make me think of that because at the beginning of the movie, Shaggy's going through his iPod and there's like the 60s, 70s songs, and it's like, I see what you're doing there, but then it never came back. Um, and it turned into this weird self help tape. But um, I did kind of enjoy the fact that there was kind of them meeting each other, but I feel like if you wanted to make it more of an origin story, which could have been cool and might have been able to tell something new about the gang, then you should have kind of committed instead of again, he meets Scooby and then they go trick or treating and then immediately they meet the mystery gang all wearing costumes that are extremely on the nose what their character are. I mean, Freddy was a knight, Daphne was Wonder Woman, and Velda was a Supreme Justice judge. It was like, wow, you had to work real hard for those ones, didn't you?
So coming around to final thoughts, leaving the spoilerverse, I maintain I think this movie would have worked better if it was billed as a Blue Falcon kind of Hanna-Barbera universe movie that included the cast of Scooby-Doo as like guest stars than the other way around. Because at the end of the day, this does not feel like a real Scooby-Doo movie to me. It's just not. So yeah, I'll give my back cookie after I hear everyone else's final thoughts, but that's my hot take.
I think Scoob is okay. It's pretty average. There are some funny jokes once in a while, even if most of the jokes are kind of bland, but there's still some, occasional laughs to be had. I think it's still exciting and colorful enough that I think kids will enjoy it. But myself being a fan of Scooby Doo as long as I have been, it was okay. Was it a slight improvement over the live action movies? I would say so, but still just a slight improvement, not a great improvement. So it was all right.
I would say that it is a slightly below average children's movie, but not a very good Scooby Doo movie. And I am actually going to slightly disagree with Ben on that point. I think it was worse than the live action movies, but for different reasons. For internal coherence and logical reasons. Even though the live action movies had a lot of problems with them, they made sense within the context they gave themselves. This movie just kind of didn't have a proper context, and it was just a bunch of. It felt more like things string together than a proper movie. Like you said, though, colorful, some funny moments. Kids would probably like it, but it wasn't a good Scooby Doo movie. It was, in fact, I think, a terrible Scooby Doo movie.
I think this movie is what it is. It's a family movie. Kids will more than likely enjoy it. It is vibrant. There's action in it. The parents, assuming that they're not diehard Scooby Doo fans, will more likely enjoy it to an extent. But it's not a premium movie. Like it does seem like it's a direct to DVD type of movie with premium actors, and just because it's a higher budget premium actors does not mean that the quality and the movie is premium. So I think if they just had any other actors, like it would have still been the exact same type of movie. Perhaps the expectation for the end product would have been different. Maybe it would have had a lower expectation and it would have probably met that.
So I will give Scoob 2.4 out of 4 bat cookies.
I'll give Scoob, I think, 1.8 out of 4 bat cookies. 1.7.
I'll give Scoob 2.3 out of 4 bat cookies. On IMDb, I gave it a 6 out of 10.
I'll actually give it a 2.5. It was entertaining. 2.5 out of 4.
So Scoob is now available for premium rental. Honestly, guys, if you're listening to this, it's not worth $25 unless, as Ben the Movie Buff kind of alluded to, you have a bunch of kids at home and you need to help keep them entertained during quarantine. Then I would say it's worth it for you. But for anyone else, wait till it's on Netflix or something. So normally we would go into the bat jar and look at our mail, but we don't have any this week.
If you want to reach the show, you can send us an email at
batjarpodcast@gmail.com.
message us on Facebook or message us on Twitter at
The Bat Cookie Jar.
You can find the Bat Jar podcast in whatever platform you listen to podcasts, including YouTube. Please give us a rating, write reviews for our shows, and share our posts on social media. This will help us to bring all people inside the Bat Jar.
And now it's time for the part of the show where we go inside the Bat Jar to find our topic for next week. Beef pork ribs, I'm going to leave it to you again to decide what we do next week, because there is technically one other comic book film that has been released so far this year that we have not talked about yet. It's got Vin Diesel in it. I think it's called either Bloodshot or Bloodsport or something with blood in the title. It's a more obscure comic book. It's not DC or Marvel. I think it's Image or something. So we could talk about that next week, or we could maybe give ourselves a few weeks of going in the jar before we come to it, because I have no idea if it's any good or not, and maybe after what we've been through this week, we need something more entertaining next week.
Is it an animated movie?
It is not.
Well, if it's Vin Diesel and it's not animated, I'll say let's go into the Bat Jar.
All right, so I have the Bat Jar here. Pull out the extra paper I've got in here. Make sure you guys can hear me getting into the Bat Jar. A little bit of an echo. All right, here we go. I got something. Okay, so we have American Ninja Warrior. So our topic for our next week's episode is going to be about American Ninja Warrior, which was a topic that someone had written into us and asked us to include in the jar. So I think I've watched maybe 4 minutes of American Ninja Warrior before. Before Gribs, have you ever heard of this show?
I've seen at least 2 full episodes at some point. Partially because... Actually, I'm not sure if it's based on the Japanese one, and I may have... If it is based on a Japanese show, I may have watched the Japanese one and not the American one. It's entirely possible, but I do know what the show is and the basic premise of it.
Ben the Movie Buff, have you ever heard of American Ninja Warrior?
Yes, I think I've seen a few clips of it here and there. I was just reading up that it is a spin-off of Sasuke, which is the Japanese version of that game, of that show. So yeah, I've seen clips here and there, and yeah, I'm actually kind of interested to talk about this next week.
Michael Andrew, have you heard of American Ninja Warrior?
Yeah, I've watched a number of episodes, both the Japanese and the American one. Is it still an ongoing thing? I haven't watched it in recent years, so I don't know if it's changed in format or whatever.
Well, we'll find out next week. So we want to first thank Michael Andrew for being here this week to talk about Scoob. Is there anything you want to plug before we sign off?
Just be kind to one another. That's all I'm plugging. And thanks for having me.
Fair enough. So we've mentioned this before, but if anyone's listening who has been a guest on the show before, you're welcome to come back, as we're recording online, working from home, remote life. We want to have as many people be a part of the Bat Jar as possible. So Michael Andrew, that extends to you as well. You're welcome to come back any week you feel like it. Ben the Movie Buff has been taking full advantage of that, and we appreciate him and his movie buffiness. Please check out his YouTube channel. There will be a link, I should say, in the description to this week's episode. And for everyone else who's listening, come back to the Bat Jar podcast next week when we talk about American Ninja Warrior. And until that time, I'm Average Joe.
I'm Beef Pork Ribs.
I'm Ben the Movie Buff.
And I'm Michael Andrew.
Catch you on the flip side.
See you in the next one.
Bye, guys.